Hello, everyone. Welcome to Elephants in the Room, where we'll be tackling the big topics like mental health, technology, the LGBTQ, and more. Our goal is to encourage and empower parents to be bold in having difficult conversations with their kids and teens. We have 6 awesome speakers that we can't wait for you to hear. Thank you for joining us.
All right. Well, hello, Southwest Church of Christ family, and thank you for letting me be here. I'm so grateful and honored to be here with you this morning. I would have loved to have been there in person, but I'm expecting our second child and am no longer able to travel. So thank you so much for being flexible in how we go about this very difficult but very important topic. I am so moved and inspired that this is a topic that you guys are willing to tackle as a church and as parents and families. This is exactly what we need around some of these elephant in the room topics, right? We need to be talking about them and wrestling with them. And I'm so moved that you guys are willing to do that with this topic. I'm just going to warn you from the start here that this is a big, broad topic, and we simply won't have enough time this morning to cover everything in order to make you feel completely comfortable with how to navigate the LGBTQ maze. That's okay. Our goal this morning is just to start the conversation and orient you a bit to this topic in general. It may feel like you're drinking from a fire hose. There's a lot here, but not to worry. This is being recorded and will be sent out to those who registered. Before we dive in here, let me just tell you a little bit about me. I grew up in a Christian home with God at the center of my household and with unconditionally loving parents. But even still, my heart was fraught with insecurity growing up, mostly about my femininity. You know, I grew up in a home where my dad was sort of the traditional stereotypical epitome of what a man is, right? He's rough and tough and gruff. And my mom is the opposite, sort of the traditional stereotypical epitome of what a woman is: gentle, quiet, and nurturing. And I was and am a lot more like my dad in personality and in character, which is something I'm very proud of now. But as a young girl with a tender heart and lots of insecurities and assumptions about myself based on those insecurities, that led me to the conclusion that I was broken as a woman, that something was wrong with me because I didn't match up to this bar of femininity that I set for myself. And that bar was my mom's example of femininity, which I could not naturally emulate. I didn't realize at the time that there are multiple ways to be masculine or feminine. So I walked around with this incredible shame that I unknowingly masked as anger and hardness and superiority, especially directed toward my mom, because deep down I resented her example of femininity and the inadequacy that it bred in my heart. So when I got into high school, after harboring this insecurity and shame my whole life, looking for validation that I was woman enough, I very innocently befriended a girl that I just simply admired. You know, she was a bit more like me. She was opinionated, strong-willed, outspoken, but she seemed okay with those parts of her, whereas I'd grown up so ashamed of those parts of me. And so as our friendship developed, so did my infatuation of her. She eventually became my idol. You know, it got to the point where my entire identity and sense of self-worth was completely wrapped up in our friendship. And so this relationship became emotionally enmeshed very quickly. And for me, it bordered on obsessive. And honestly, when this level of emotional attachment is reached, this level of idolatry in a friendship, especially among women, it's so easy for a physical relationship to follow. And so that's exactly what happened. And this experience sort of springboarded me into a life of homosexuality. And I lived as a lesbian for a time before I eventually very happily surrendered my heart to God when I became a Christian. I'm now happily married. My husband and son and I, we've got another boy on the way. We live in Eastern North Carolina. And I'm also a provisionally licensed marriage and family therapist in North Carolina. And I get to walk alongside individuals and couples and families who are wrestling through their gender or their sexual identity. And I've learned a lot along the way. I'm excited to share some of that with you today. We're going to start right from the beginning and look at some different stages of development that might contribute toward gender identity or sexual identity development. You know, believe it or not, we start to see signs of sexual orientation development and gender identity awareness as early as the ages of about 4 to 6. It's during this developmental stage that children are very avid observers of their parents. And this is the age that children start to recognize gender roles within their families. And then they begin to develop personal beliefs about themselves and their gender and about cultural expectations and stereotypes related to their gender. Also, during this time, something called gender typicality starts to form as children begin to notice whether they behave and think and process the way that others of their same sex do. And if a child is unable to emulate their personal expectations of these gender roles, this may affect what's called their gender contentedness or their feeling of efficacy as it relates to their gender role. So this has the potential to lead to a lot of confusion, frustration, even shame for children in this age range that struggle with some of these developmental milestones. So if you're the parent of a child in this age range, it's important for you to talk to your child about sex, sexuality, and gender roles, and normalize these topics in your home. Also normalize breaking gender stereotypes that the world has constructed that are not necessarily biblical. You know, your daughter needs to know that if she hates dresses and loves monster trucks, she's still a girl because God made her that way. If your son hates sports and loves to bake, he's still a boy because God made him that way. You know, I also encourage families with kids in this age range, really any age range, to have family devotionals or regular times of connection. God should be at the center of it. Yes, that's very important. But these times of connection do so much more than that. They build connection and safety, belonging, and identity in your child, and it provides fun in your family. We just did a Devo on Jonah with my 3-year-old. You know, we tossed the pillows off the couch to simulate throwing the luggage off board, right? We made a fort to simulate the whale's belly, and he cannot stop talking about it. He asks to do it again and again every day. This is the kind of fun that breeds connection in families, and connection leads to safety and trust within your home. So eventually your child feels safe in coming to talk to you about some of these elephant in the room topics. Then from the ages of about 6 to 11, as children's sexual orientation and gender identity continues to develop, their sphere of influence now expands beyond just their parents, and it includes friendships. In fact, a key component of this developmental stage is social competence, or the ability to create and maintain meaningful relationships. Now, struggling with aspects of social competence could be devastating enough as a child, but if it's coupled with unresolved issues from that previous stage of development, mainly gender contentedness, this could really snowball for a child and create some difficulties, not the least of which could be having a difficult time relating to peers of the same gender. The central process item in this stage of development is education. This is a broad definition of education, right? The kind of education where our children learn about what our culture values as important. And this type of education happens everywhere, all the time, in our homes, in our churches, on TV, on social media, in peer relationships, in public. Everywhere we look, there are clues as to what our culture values. Think about the kinds of lessons that our kids are learning from our culture right now. Things like your emotion equals truth. If someone disagrees with you, they hate you. If you disagree with someone, you hate them. Love of self is the most important type of love, right? Being in a minority is inherently good. Being in a majority is inherently bad. These are the kinds of lessons that our kids are soaking up like sponges, and it is absolutely affecting their gender and their sexual identities. So if you're the parent of a child in this age range, you want to make sure that you're aiding them in their peer connection. I know that this is especially difficult to do during a global pandemic, but they need to be able to grow in their confidence with connecting to their peers. This is also the time to start talking to your kids about what they're learning outside of your homes about some of these difficult topics. You want to be the ones to provide the foundation of their knowledge on things like sex, sexuality, and gender before their peers do, or before the media does, so that your child is less susceptible to the world's misguided information on this, which they will inevitably be exposed to. But most importantly, you want to make sure that there is no judgment or shame surrounding these topics in your home. This might require you as the parent to develop a healthier view of sex, sexuality, and gender. We all have brokenness or trauma or distorted beliefs around these topics in our own lives that are way too easy to pass on to our kids. We want to be rooted in God's perspective in these areas so that we can help create normalcy and protection around our children and in our homes surrounding these topics. Now, while parents and friends might have maintained an equal influence on children up until this stage, it's usually in early adolescence between the ages of 12 to 18 that children now begin to mainly be influenced by their peers. In fact, the central process item in this stage of development is group identity, where teens and preteens are actively looking for where they belong in this world outside of their parents' homes. And so this developmental stage is sort of the championship of sexual orientation and gender identity development, because though they've been forming up until now, it's usually in this stage that they're formalized and then eventually expressed to other people. Another thing to keep in mind in this developmental stage is that your preteen and teenager's brain is going through a major remodel. This can be a really awkward time for parents and teenagers because part of your child's brain, the primitive brain, the part that's responsible for breathing and blinking and the creation of big emotions, that part of the brain is fully formed. But the part of your child's brain that is not fully formed during this stage is the frontal lobe, the part that's responsible for decision-making and weighing the risk of certain behaviors and thinking through long-term consequences. That part of the brain still has a long way to go in terms of its development. So what's so awkward for parents and teenagers during this stage is that sometimes your teenager will exude tremendous maturity. You might even think, wow, they are really grown up. They're getting ready for life outside the nest. I've done a great job, right? And then sometimes your teenager does or says something so appalling and so in need of maturity and insight that it's hard to reconcile these two different teenagers living in your kid's body, right? This can be very odd to encounter with your child, but the best thing we can do to help our child through this is to not shame them simply because their frontal lobe is not fully formed. They have no control over this. The best thing you can do is to help them to develop an integrated brain. And we can do this by helping our kids expand the lens of their emotional experience, by digging underneath the secondary emotion to the primary emotion that they're experiencing. We can calmly and lovingly help our children to discern what they're feeling and why. And then we can help them to rationalize what the best responses or what kind of effect this has on their life overall, even when their emotions are fighting to take over and telling them something different. All right, so now that we've got an idea of what's happening developmentally with our kids as their sexual and gender identities are forming, let's talk about some general differences between male and female sexuality. First and foremost, I've learned that male and female sexuality are really quite different. Now, I don't want to overgeneralize because certainly everyone is different and same-sex attraction manifests differently for everyone. But I would say that most of the women that I've worked with, not all of them, but most of them, would not necessarily say that they feel as if they were born attracted to other women. Now, that's very different from most of the men that I've spoken to. Most of them would say that from their earliest memory, they've been attracted to other men. But women usually describe their attraction to other women as more of this process developing throughout their early childhood and adolescence. Also, sexual attraction for women tends to be more fluid. A group of social scientists studying sexual attraction in women found that men are more specific and narrow in their patterns of arousal. That is, that heterosexual men are aroused by female sexual stimuli, but not male sexual stimuli. And for gay men, it's the opposite. Females, on the other hand, whether heterosexual or lesbian, experience arousal to both male and female sexual stimuli, demonstrating a broader, more general pattern of arousal. So this means that if something has been sexualized, a woman has the potential to be sexually aroused by it, no matter what gender is involved. Now, this is a huge discovery about female sexuality. Women have the ability to be sexually aroused by both men and women. Not that all women most certainly will be sexually aroused by anything and everyone, but just that women have the ability to be sexually aroused by anything that has been sexualized. Now, imagine how confusing this would be for any woman, especially a young girl who happens to see, an overly sexualized commercial on TV depicting another woman, feels sexually aroused by it, which is something she has no control over, and not understanding that it may not be because of the gender portrayed necessarily, but simply because that content has been sexualized, that she feels that sexual arousal. In today's progressive climate, this may be enough to convince a young woman that she is gay simply because she experienced arousal toward another woman, which is not uncommon even for heterosexually attracted women. So female sexual attraction is more fluid than men's, but it's also more broad. Dr. Lisa Diamond, a social scientist also studying female sexuality, she did a 10-year longitudinal study, and she discovered that among women who initially identified themselves as heterosexual, lesbian, bisexual, or unlabeled, after 10 years, more than 2/3 of the women had changed their identity label a few times. And when they changed their sexual identities, they typically broadened rather than narrowed their potential range of attractions and relationships. So over the course of a woman's life, it's not uncommon for her to ascribe to multiple sexual orientations. Not that she is changing her sexual orientation, right? Who she's attracted to does not necessarily change on a daily basis, but the range of potential attractions is so much more broad than a man's range of potential attractions, that if society insists on placing all of these descriptors on sexual attraction, gay, straight, bisexual, then some women may appear as if they are changing who they're attracted to all of the time because their attraction ability exists in such a wide range. So female sexual attraction is more fluid and more broad than male sexual attraction, which makes sense because social scientists have also found that men and women connect differently. Men usually can't or connect emotionally until they first feel physically connected to their partner, right? Women usually can't or won't want to be physically intimate with a partner without first feeling emotionally connected to them. So it makes sense then that a woman's attraction has the potential to develop to whomever she feels emotionally connected to. And the prime time of our sexual orientation development happens in our preteen and our teenage years. And who do preteen and teenage girls usually feel most connected to? Usually it's to their female peers. And the crux of that desire for connection typically has little to do with a physical connection. The crux of that desire is usually rooted in emotional connection and intimacy. And so we start to see how easy it is, especially for young women, to feel as if they just ended up in a same-sex relationship because it usually starts fairly innocently with an emotional connection. Now, we don't have time to go through the ins and outs of what the Bible says about homosexuality. You can read Guy Hammond's new book, Gay and Christian, to cover that in a very in-depth way. But let me just say very briefly here that the Bible is very clear from the beginning that sex is meant to be reserved between one man and one woman in marriage. Engaging in homosexual activity is clearly sinful as laid out by the Bible. However, it says nothing about being attracted to the same sex. that is not sinful. It's what we do with that attraction that can become sinful or righteous, just like any other temptation any of us could have, right? It's not sinful to be tempted. It is sinful to act on those temptations. So that's why I refer to myself as a same-sex attracted Christian, not a gay Christian. Let me also say that the Bible makes it very clear that each person is created by God and therefore ought to be treated with kindness, dignity, and respect, no matter what their sexual orientation is. Yeah, so much more to be said here, but we'll have to move on to the other part of this maze, the T, the transgender part. So before we do anything with this topic, let's take a look at some terms just to help orient us to this discussion. There are a lot of terms out there today. It's overwhelming. You know, my take on this is we're not of this world, but we do live in it. So I certainly don't think we need to become all consumed with these terms and stay abreast of every single change that's made within this language. But I do think that it behooves us as God's ambassadors in this world to have a good foundational understanding of some of these terms so that we can effectively communicate with people in this world. I wonder if that's part of what Paul was talking about when he says we need to be all things to all people. I also think understanding some of these terms hopefully makes it a bit less confusing and scary and disorienting for us as we're navigating this in our culture. So in that light, let's take a look at some of these terms. Transgender is a big, broad umbrella term used to describe someone that identifies as a separate gender than the gender that they were assigned at birth. So someone who identifies as transgender may use any number of terms to describe themselves, including, but certainly not limited to, any of these terms that you see here. Let me just say briefly too, this is a really broad term that encompasses a lot of different gender identity experiences. If someone uses this term, we really don't have much understanding of their unique experience with their gender identity. So we really want to dig beyond this term to find out the story behind it. A transgender female or trans woman was assigned male at birth and now identifies as female. And a trans man was assigned female at birth and now identifies as male. Sex has to do with biology, excuse me, and it's tied to reproductive organs and secondary sex characteristics like chromosomes and hormones. Gender used to be used synonymously with sex. And some people still use these terms interchangeably today, but today it really has a couple of different uses. Gender identity is someone's personal, internal sense of their gender, while their gender expression is their external expression of that internal gender identity. Non-binary is a designation someone could use to convey that they don't adhere to a gender binary, male and female. They may see gender as existing on a spectrum. And so they may refer to themselves as any number of these terms listed here, or certainly many others they could choose from as well. And then sexual orientation is really not related to these terms. Sexual orientation is a term used to describe which gender you're attracted to, but this is not necessarily tied to or dependent on someone's gender expression or gender identity. Gender dysphoria is Gender dysphoria is a term used by the mental health community. It's a clinical mental health diagnosis that indicates that someone has marked incongruence over their biological sex and their internal experience of their gender identity. So in order for this to be diagnosed, this incongruence also has to be accompanied by what's called marked distress over this incongruence. So distress that affects typical functioning in everyday life. So typically people diagnosed with gender dysphoria might say that from their earliest memory, they felt that they're in the wrong body and it's negatively affected a lot of areas of their life. Now, just as a side note here, studies show that 70 to 90% of children that experience gender dysphoria in early childhood outgrow it by the time they exit puberty. So just a little tidbit there. Now, sort of the new term on the block is rapid onset gender dysphoria or adolescent onset gender dysphoria. This is still a new phenomenon being studied. Our understanding of this is still in progress. But the way that it's viewed right now is that this is a much quicker process, right? These are not necessarily people that would say that from their earliest memory, they felt that they're in the wrong body. They might say that this feeling of dysphoria with their gender happened quickly, usually within adolescence, between the ages of about 12 to 18. So what I've seen, just anecdotally in my personal practice, is that people whose experience falls more in line with this rapid onset gender dysphoria, they may use this term transgender or another term within that umbrella to describe who they are rather than how they are or how they experience their gender identity. So whatever term they use is very tied to their identity, which we learned is a really big deal during that age range, trying to piece together who you are. There has been research that says that rapid onset gender dysphoria is more prominent in natal females, and that there tends to be a bit more of a social influence on this designation. Things like YouTube videos, social media, peer influence, things like that. And so individuals in this population may or may not end up undergoing sexual reassignment surgery or hormone replacement therapy. But this population does typically reject the idea of a gender binary and ascribes to one or multiple designations under that umbrella term transgender. There really is so much more to say on this, as this is the biggest growing trend in the LGBTQ community right now. One study said that rapid onset gender dysphoria in natal females increased by 5,000% in 1 year. We don't have time to dive any further into this, but a great book on this topic is Irreversible Damage by Abigail Schreier, if you want to learn more about that. Usually I have several slides that I go through regarding what the Bible says about gender and gender identity. In the interest of time, I'm going to just briefly summarize a few key points about what the Bible says on this. If you want a more comprehensive look at this, you can check out that book I've referenced earlier, Guy Hammond's new book, Gay and Christian. But just very briefly, what I see in the Bible first is that there is a clear gender binary that God expects his people, the people that live for him and have given their life to him, right, to abide by. This is clearly stated in Genesis 1:27, and then it's reinforced all throughout the Bible by mankind only being referred to in binary categories, right? Husbands and wives, brothers and sisters. We never see a reference to a gender outside of male and female. In fact, God expressly forbids us from crossing gender boundaries in places like 1 Corinthians 6:9 and in Deuteronomy 22:5. There's also evidence in the Bible of our sexed differences as man and woman being directly correlated to the image of God. Right? There's a lot of complementary language used to describe men and women. Eve is referred to as a suitable helper using this Hebrew word, ezer kinegdo. The word kinegdo is a compound word. The first word, ki, means same, and the second word, neged, means opposite. So we see that Adam and Eve are both same, they're both human and different. They're male and female. This is just like God, right? God is all, Father, Son, and Spirit. They're the same, yes, but they're also different. And we see this in the way that God created our gender. And something about this sex difference is directly related to us being made in the image of God. And then finally, the Bible is very clear that our bodies are intentional and sacred. They were not haphazardly made. There is no mistake in our gender. Our bodies are compared to God's temple, a structure that houses the presence of the Lord on earth, and therefore great care was taken in creating it. But also great care and reverence needs to be exuded in stewarding the bodies that God gave us. Our bodies are who we are, not just part of who we are. Paul models this when he uses the terms your bodies and yourselves interchangeably when he's calling people to righteousness in Romans 12 and 1 Corinthians 6. We do see in scripture that our bodies will undergo some changes when our mortal bodies are resurrected into spiritual bodies in heaven, and several differences are mentioned, but sex difference is not mentioned. In fact, Jesus was still male when he was resurrected. And according to 1 John 3:2, we're supposed to be like him when we're resurrected. So it would appear to me that our gender is not just an earthly construct, it follows us into the next life, and it is purposefully sexed within a binary. So, based on what I see from the Bible, I think it's clear that God did create two and only two distinct and equally sacred genders. However, that doesn't mean that there are only two ways of living out our gender, right? There are not two archetypes in the Bible, one for what a man is and one for what a woman is. In our society, Satan has really put a lot of constraints on masculinity and femininity. And we as a human race have really bought into this, right? Men are supposed to be aggressive and non-emotional, and women are supposed to be kind and gentle and communicative. And perhaps where we have the strictest constraints on masculinity and femininity is within the church body, right? But these constraints that we've put on men and women, these socially constructed gender roles, are not always biblical. We see this over and over in the Bible. Look how often Jesus and God refer to themselves in maternal, nurturing roles. Look how David is portrayed. His strength and might is on full display, yes, but so are his tenderness and vulnerability before God. There are lots of women in the Bible too that are upheld as godly, righteous women that break gender stereotypes, right? There were some pretty violent women in the Bible, like Jael, some strong female leaders portrayed in the Bible, like Deborah, women who sweat and toiled to provide for their families, like Ruth or the Proverbs 31 woman. All throughout the Bible, we see that our idea of what a man and a woman is sometimes not necessarily based on God's expectations of men and women. I think we need to be really mindful of this because, like we discussed, our awareness of these stereotypical gender roles starts very early in life, and it impacts our development and our perspective that leads to innate beliefs about ourselves and the world around us. These gender stereotypes that can feel so oppressive to people all throughout their childhood, though they're not typically able to communicate it until their teenage years when they say, Mom, Dad, I'm transgender. What we don't see in that teenage proclamation is the decade or more of confusion, isolation, shame, even perceived failure at meeting the cultural and societal expectations of their gender. So I think this is something that when we encounter it, deserves a lot of care and compassion and understanding. So, wow, that was a lot of information and a lot to process. Usually from here, I go into the second part of this training where we talk about what do we do with this information? How do we help our kids who are being inundated by this every single day? Unfortunately, we don't have time to dive into that, but I did give some handouts that you'll hopefully receive on the way out that go over some parts of that. I will too just briefly summarize the three categories that I've broken it up into here. I would say first, as parents, we need to set the frame of our own hearts on this. We know that out of the overflow of our hearts, our mouths speak. And I would say our reaction to our kids comes forth as well, right, from our hearts. We have got to be rooted in God on this, both in our theology of the biblical sexual ethic and in our theology of unconditional and scandalous love that God gives to us and that he expects from us. Second, we can utilize the practicals and the resources that are available to us in this topic to aid us in how we navigate this in our families. Strength and Weakness obviously is a phenomenal resource as you're navigating this, particularly our parent support groups that offer connection, belonging, and guidance from people who are going through some of the very same things. I also have a list of resources available on my website, heartsetabove.com, that you can utilize as you're navigating this with your kids as well. And then finally, we have got to communicate with our kids in a way that stems from our love, not our fear. It is too tempting to react to our kids out of our fear in this, but they need to know that we are not afraid of sin. We are not afraid of this world going in a different direction than what God intended. We are faithful because we are firmly rooted in God. We know who's really in charge. That's the message we want to convey to our children. We want to teach them in the way that they should go, yes, and we want to offer them appropriate boundaries and consequences when necessary, but not out of our fear, out of our love. That's what we see in the way God parents us, right? That's the example we want to strive to emulate with our kids as well. So that's what I've got this morning. Like I said, there's a lot more here. Check out some of those resources for more information on this. But I hope that this was a good starting point to prepare you to navigate the LGBTQ maze in your families. Thanks so much for being here with me this morning.